So, what is the world's healthiest diet? This is arguably the goal of nutrition science, to answer this question. But if you open up your phone, you go online, on social media, you'll see there's so much confusion. So how can we make sense of this and actually figure out how to eat in a way that's healthful for us? So let's break it down. So there are some things that we know they're not really good for anyone. These are things like processed foods, sugar-sweetened beverages, refined carbohydrates, trans fats. All experts agree on this. There's no one out there saying that we need to be eating more donuts and more candies to be healthy. So taking away from that, we know there is this foundational diet for health. And this was actually summarized really well by Michael Pollan in his book, where he interviewed experts from all around the world and came to the conclusion: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And if we were to summarize a healthy diet, it would be in this sentence. But obviously it is not just that simple. So let's get deeper down into the specifics. So there's these key points of a healthy diet that everyone agrees on. Some more whole foods, more vegetables, less refined grains, less refined sugar, less processed foods. No one disagrees with this. Even the keto people, the low-fat vegans, we can all agree that doing these things would greatly improve health on a global scale. Yet nearly no one is doing this. In Western developed countries, people's diets are mostly made up of processed packaged foods. If we just focused on these basics of eating more fruits and vegetables, less processed food, more whole food, it could solve a huge amount of the nutritional issues that we see plaguing our society today. Things like increased rates of diabetes and heart disease that impact so many people and lead to so much loss of life. So then, building on that framework, the next things that all of the experts agree on, we've got things like legumes. So these are beans. People say there's lectins in them, but that's not a problem. When you cook them, it removes 99.99% of the lectins. It is not an issue. They're a great source of protein, and actually the popular book saying that lectins are bad for us got reviewed by experts and got a whopping 26 out of 100 for scientific accuracy. So we shouldn't be listening to this sort of stuff. But I get it, it can be so confusing when you see so much conflicting information online. So next we have fruit. But fruit, it's got sugar, it's toxic, it's gonna give us diabetes. But fruit, it's in a food matrix, so we've got polyphenols and fiber that actually dampen the blood sugar response. They feed the beneficial bacteria in our microbiome and actually reduce our risk of diabetes. We've got things like nuts and seeds, but they have fat in them, oh my God. But it's mostly unsaturated fat. They're actually beneficial for our cardiovascular health, for our brain health, helping to promote healthy skin, giving the body what it needs to build our cells. As well as things like eggs, but they have cholesterol in them. But it turns out that actually dietary cholesterol doesn't have a massive impact on our actual cholesterol levels, depending on your baseline intake. There's a bit of nuance here. But again, if you're gonna eat eggs, I recommend having a look at where you're getting them from, because as we know, the egg industry is very, very cruel, and it's not something that I personally would want to support. And so then there's other things like fish. I get it, it's a living animal as well, but they're generally considered to be healthy, especially because they're a source of omega-3s, which are incredibly important fats for our cardiovascular health and our brain health. And so then there's other questions. So we've got things like poultry. So what about grilled, organic, free range, pasture, whatever chicken compared to deep fried chicken wings from KFC? You can see there's a bit of a difference here. And then grains. So what about something like steel cut oats versus white bread? As you can see, again, there's quite a bit of a difference here. Then we have things like dairy and red meat. And here, there's things like plain unsweetened yogurt that may be beneficial for some people. And in terms of red meat, are you having hot dogs and salami and cured processed meats? Or are you occasionally having some unprocessed red meat? So all nutrition experts agree on these things. Whatever country you're in, if you search the dietary guidelines for your country, it will probably be something like what I have just talked about. Mostly whole foods, mostly plants. There's room for some animal products, focusing on maybe eggs and fish because they seem to have the best health outcomes. A little bit of red meat, not processed red meat. I mean, it's not the sexiest thing. It's more fun to just argue online, right? You should be vegan, you should be carnivore. Because controversial things are what gets clicks, likes, and follows in our modern social media world. And so getting into the guidelines, what about the people saying that it's the guidelines that are killing us? We've been following these guidelines, clearly. They were put out 40 years ago, and people are sicker than ever. It's the guidelines that are killing us. Well, for example, if you look at the dietary guidelines from a country like the United States, they've been updated every 5 years since the 1980s, and they are essentially the same. All of these things that I've just covered. Watch your calories, avoid added sugar, avoid excess saturated fat, make sure you're getting enough exercise. And so this core healthy diet is essentially the same as well, whether we're focused on cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes. And the diets that we have the strongest evidence for in terms of this are things like the Mediterranean diet, which is basically including lots of whole, unprocessed fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, whole grains, some fish, some eggs, maybe very occasionally some red meat and poultry. In terms of actual published data, this is what has the best, strongest evidence behind it. But of course, there is some individual variation. We all have different microbiomes that maybe process the food that we eat differently. Because of different genetic, lifestyle, and environmental factors, we might not have access to the same foods. So we have this kind of healthy foundational diet that we know is beneficial, but you can actually customize it to fit your needs. But it's not important to be focusing on these things at their very edges. I do better when I wake up at 5 a.m. I have a cold shower. I stare at the sun for 2 hours. Then I work out for 3 hours. I do a 4-hour meditation while sunning my butthole. And then it's time for breakfast. No, but now you're eating highly processed keto muffins for breakfast because you're not sure what's healthy for you. Because you think you need to avoid whole grains, or soy, or red meat, or eggs, or whatever it is. The thing is, this core healthy diet is 97% of our nutritional health. Maybe these little specific superfoods and supplements, they might have a 1% effect on our health. But if you focus on getting this core right, then you can play with these little things. But if you're still eating mostly processed food and you're drinking miracle water to make you healthy, it is just not going to do anything. You're wasting your time and money. So in order to look at dietary changes over time on a population level, this study is really interesting. It shows changes in intake of carbs, protein, and fat over time. These are basically the 3 main essential macronutrients that our bodies use for energy. So this runs from 1999 to 2016. And if we're looking at fats, saturated, unsaturated, it stayed about the same. Same with protein coming from animal and plant sources. But when we look at carbohydrates, only about 8% of energy is coming from whole carbs. 45% of energy intake is coming from these processed carbs that we know are bad for our health. These are our processed foods. So do we have room for a lower carb diet in our society? Absolutely, if it's lowering these processed carbohydrates. Because almost half of the caloric intake is coming from these processed carbohydrates. But could we replace almost all of that 50% of energy with whole carbohydrates? That would be difficult. Imagine eating bowls of beans, legumes, wholemeal bread, tons and tons of fruits and veggies. Or what about healthy, unsaturated fats? Maybe we'd be eating avocados and avocados, having cups of olive oil on top of our salad. Obviously, that's not really doable either. And so basically to reach a healthy diet, we would need to replace some of that with some healthy fats and some healthy unprocessed carbohydrates from whole foods. So if we're switching our diet away from this processed food diet to a less processed diet, it has to come from higher quality carbs or fats. If we look at protein intakes globally, they're about 15 to 20% of calories coming from protein. And in nutrition research, many researchers actually try to get people to change the protein intake of their diet. But what they find is they end up changing their ratio of carbs and fats. It's actually very, very difficult to change our intake of protein. So when it comes to building a healthy diet, we're replacing these low quality carbs with some whole carbohydrates and some fats. But it's too hard to do just one, so basically we're gonna end up probably with a slightly lower carb diet that's slightly higher in healthy fats. It's not too low maybe compared to something like keto, but it's lower than what we might have been eating previously. because we're not eating a ton of added sugar and refined grains. And obviously there's a whole lot of wiggle room here. You can find what works for you. There might be some individual variation. You might feel more satiated with a slightly lower carb diet. Some other people might feel satiated with a slightly higher carbohydrate diet. So listen to your body. This is where individual variation comes in. We have kind of the general guidelines for a healthy diet, but then you can customize that to your specific needs. Because when we're looking at a big population level, we're giving average recommendations. But the thing is, no specific person is an exact average, so it will be different for you. So use these core concepts as a guide, customize it to your needs. And this is where working with a health professional like a nutritionist can be really helpful. This is the work that I do with my clients, helping them to create something that allows them to meet their goals while eating in a way that they know is supporting their long-term health. So to sum up everything from this video, all nutrition experts agree on the fundamentals of a healthy diet, and it can be summed up by the quote from Michael Pollan: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Once you get that right, there's totally room there to customize that to meet your needs. We get way more benefit focusing on this core, which is 97% of our health, rather than focusing on these things at the edges. And there's a lot of individual variation with this, so what works for you might not work for someone else, and what's working for someone else might not work for you. So don't judge yourself if you're not quite the same as your favorite influencer online or your favorite podcaster, or your friend, family member, whatever. The most important thing is for you to listen to your body and find what works for you. And remember, it's what we do most of the time that determines our health, not what we do sometimes. It's not saying you can never ever eat your favorite processed foods ever again. You absolutely can. There's space for that within a healthy dietary pattern, but we're mainly focusing on whole foods. And if you are wanting to make healthy changes to your diet and you're not sure about how much protein you need to be getting, then you should watch this video where I talk all about protein and give you everything that you need to know to make an informed choice on the foods that you eat.